Putin gives Modi a discount on the crude. They refine it and they ship it to Europe, Africa, and Asia at a big premium, and they make a ton of money. Now, what's wrong with that picture? Well, it fuels the Russian war machine, and then the taxpayers lose because we got to fund Modi's war, okay? Understand what's going on here. You got Brahmins profiteering at the expense of the Indian people. I don't understand why he's getting to bed with Putin and Xi Jinping when he's the biggest democracy in the world. So I would just simply say to the Indian people, please understand what's going on here. You got Brahmins profiteering at the expense of the Indian people. We need that to stop.
You know, there are certain people who every time they open their mouth, say things that smell worse than a filthy public toilet. And that person is Peter Navarro. Who is he, you may ask? Well, Peter Navarro is one of Trump's minions. But he's more like Trump's bootlicking sidekick, or maybe his court jester, with a Harvard degree. Officially, he was Trump's key advisor on tariffs. And yes, believe it or not, this guy actually has a PhD in economics from Harvard. Which is hilarious, because he still doesn't understand how the world economy even works. And what does he do with all that education? He spends his days and nights working overtime to destroy India-US relations. He calls the Russia-Ukraine war Modi's war. He says India is a laundromat for Russia, that India is opportunistic and deeply corrosive, that Indians are arrogant, that India is getting in bed with authoritarians. And my personal favorite, he crowned India the Maharaja of Tariffs. Oh, and apparently the road to world peace runs through New Delhi. So in this video, we're going to shine a light on his garbage ideas, the trash he fed into the Trump administration, and how he effectively destroyed a relationship that the US spent nearly 20 years building. Billions of dollars went into this partnership, and Navarro just on it. But before we dive into this so-called Harvard PhD's genius economic theories, let's start simple. No complicated geopolitics, no heavy jargon. Just plain words on what the US and Navarro's brilliant team of impeccable ministers have actually been doing for the past 6 months. So here's the story. One day America woke up and suddenly decided that the whole world, Europe, Mexico, South America, Canada, Asia, was scamming them. And what did the US do about it? They put a tax on their own people. They called it tariffs, which basically means putting extra taxes on goods imported from other countries. And who pays for that in the end? Not the exporters, not the foreign governments. It's the American public, footing the bill. Sure, the exporting countries feel some pain, their products get less competitive, but here's the catch, the US didn't target just 1 or 2 countries. They slapped tariffs on everybody. Which means everything got more expensive, across the board, making the market even more volatile. Now let's dissect all the garbage Navarro spewed about India. The first one is this gem. India is financing Putin's war machine. His argument goes like this. India bought discounted Russian oil, refined it, and then even sold fuel to the West, which somehow means innocent little Europeans were tricked into buying Russian oil through clever old India. But here's the reality. If Europe had even a worm-sized conscience, they wouldn't have bought a single drop of refined oil from India. The truth is, they needed this oil to stabilize global prices. In fact, India was doing the world a favor by keeping fuel costs from exploding. And by the way, it was Biden's gang that asked India to do that. And here's the hypocrisy, Navarro only sees Indian oil, but not his own country's business with Russia. When someone asked him about America's dealings, he said he'd get back with an answer.
India says that the US imports Russian uranium, chemicals, fertilizers, while criticizing their energy imports. Your response to that, sir?
I don't know anything about it. I'd have to check, but we'll get back to you on that. Yep.
Spoiler alert. Still no answer. Meanwhile, these innocent Europeans he talks about are actually some of the biggest buyers of Russian LNG. Why? Because they need gas to cook food for their families. And when it's for their families, it's justified, no matter how many civilians die in Ukraine. But if India buys oil, oh, suddenly it's a scandal. Never mind that India isn't even the biggest purchaser. That crown goes to China, with Turkey, our NATO country, also buying a lot. So how did Navarro come up with this impeccable math? Oh, right, because he's a Harvard PhD. And apparently, Harvard PhDs are never wrong. Now let's play a little numbers game. The US population is about 342 million. India's population is about 1.46 billion. Wrap your head around that. To keep a democracy that size running, rules, policing, military, economy, and elections every 5 years, takes enormous effort. Almost a billion people voting peacefully is what gives India democratic legitimacy, something neither China nor Russia can claim. And with neighbors like China, Pakistan, Myanmar, plus Indian Ocean vulnerabilities, India's police, paramilitary, and armed forces aren't just about domestic law and order, they're about stopping instability foreign powers would love to exploit. India's massive population makes it both a huge market and a manufacturing hub. But here's the twist. To stay stable, India has to balance welfare for the poor with growth for the middle class. If it fails, unrest spills over, migration crises, weaker deterrence, or even foreign interference. That's why geopolitically, India is a security anchor in South Asia and a counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific. Now, to do all this, India needs oil. It imports around 85% of its crude. Without oil, transport stalls, industries shut down, the military weakens, and even elections become logistically impossible. When oil prices go up, everything else becomes more expensive: food, transport, and daily living, hurting the economy. And with 1.46 billion people to answer to, the government comes under massive pressure. That's why energy security isn't just economics for India, it's survival. India will buy oil from any country that gives value for money. At one point, Iran was a major supplier, until the US told India to stop. Since 2022, discounted Russian oil has filled that gap. That's not funding Putin. That's keeping India's economy stable and maintaining strategic independence. Now flip the scenario. Imagine the US with 1.4 billion people. America's current debt is $38 trillion, already 120% of GDP, with just 330 million people. Scale that to 1.4 billion, and while the per capita debt shrinks on paper, the absolute cost of governance explodes. Healthcare, policing, infrastructure, welfare, all crumble. Entitlement programs balloon, out of control. Policing becomes impossible. The US already struggles with law and order, gun violence, and crime. Multiply that by 4, and watch the courts collapse. The US military might be global, but stretch it to cover 1.4 billion citizens domestically, and foreign capacity vanishes. That's India's daily reality. It has to stay strong at home, while also being a dependable partner abroad. Some countries, like Bhutan, even rely entirely on India's military support. And yet, Navarro can't even grasp this basic reality, while showing up on every news channel to vomit out his garbage thoughts on India. Now let's get to his second garbage talk, Modi's war. According to Navarro, when two countries fight, apparently, it's not their war, it's the fault of some third country minding its own business and feeding its population. So, by his logic, the Russia-Ukraine war isn't Putin's invasion, it's Modi's war. Modi's the one bombing Ukrainian cities, not Putin. Makes total sense, right? Reality check, it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine. India didn't start it, India isn't fighting in it. Navarro saying this is like a guy chugging vodka while lecturing you on sobriety. And this is coming from America, of all places. That's rich. Let's talk history. Iran, 1953 coup with the UK, Iraq, 2003, Libya, 2011, Kuwait, 1991 Gulf War, Syria, 2011, present. And don't forget the US tried its luck in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Grenada, Panama, Yugoslavia, but couldn't exactly spread democracy there either.
Newly discovered oil reserves.
Oil? Excuse me 1 second. Operation Golden Eagle is a go.
Because here's the truth. The US doesn't invade poor countries with no oil, in the name of democracy. Funny how freedom always flows in the same direction as the pipelines. Navarro said, India is undermining democracy by siding with Russia. This is the biggest garbage statement that's ever come out of his mouth. Hear me out, and I assure you it will make sense. Let's go back to the 1970s.
For one thing, they're the only agency in the area capable of seeing that the 10 million Bengali refugees now in India get safely back to Bangladesh. For another, Indian soldiers, no matter how much the Indian government likes to play this down, are the only people capable of keeping law and order here and protecting minority groups from Bengali retribution. In addition, the army is safeguarding the lives of those Bengalis who ran the civil administration for Pakistan. The Bangladesh government is setting up a war crimes tribunal to try Dr. Malik and his colleagues. Will the Indian army be told by Delhi to hand them over? Before the Indian army can think about leaving Bangladesh, 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war will have to be transported to India.
There was a war between India and Pakistan, initiated by Pakistan of course. And during that war, the so-called oldest democracy, the United States, tried to intimidate the world's largest democracy by sending the 7th Fleet into the Indian Ocean, all to help Pakistan, which at the time was a notorious military dictatorship, and still is. Do you know who actually stepped up to protect democracy? Yes, the Soviet Union, the largest authoritarian state, back then, by deploying nuclear submarines, armed with missiles, to block US access, and backing the Indian Navy as it struck the Karachi port. That support ultimately led to the creation of Bangladesh, freeing it from the countless atrocities of the Pakistani army. The fact is, India's ties with Russia go back decades, mostly in defense, and now in energy too. But India also works with the US, its official, strategic partner, with Europe, and the Quad is the biggest example of that. So if Navarro really wants to talk about undermining democracy, maybe he should start with January 6th, right in his own backyard. Navarro pointing fingers at India for getting in bed with dictators is pure comedy when you stack it against America's own record. But hold on, what was America doing cozying up with Putin in Alaska? No ceasefire deal, nothing serious on Ukraine, just floating business deals with Moscow. And forget Russia for a second. What about Trump smiling and shaking hands with Kim Jong-un, like they were best buddies at a summit? Or take that 90-day truce with China. The US rushed into that deal, even though China was buying way more from Russia than India ever did. Why? Because China threatened to choke rare earth exports materials, critical for America's tech sector. Washington panicked, because without those, Silicon Valley grinds to a halt.
The President Trump threatening to slap China with additional tariffs.
China. 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 China.
China announced this morning that from next week they will be imposing 34% tariffs on all US goods.
US President Donald Trump has threatened an additional 50% tax on Chinese goods if Beijing doesn't drop its 34% retaliatory tariff on US products.
China, the dominant global supplier of rare earth elements, has escalated its economic influence by imposing new export restrictions on critical materials.
China proved how leverage works. One threat, and Washington bows. But what most people miss is that India holds a similar kind of leverage. It's not just the world's largest democracy, it's also the pharmacy of the world. The US healthcare system leans heavily on Indian pharmaceuticals. If New Delhi ever decided to slow exports, America's medical sector would feel the shockwaves instantly. That's why you'll notice pharma is conveniently missing from Washington's tariff list. So the next time someone says India has no leverage, think again. If the US keeps piling on pressure, India could easily pull a China move of its own. Navarro also said, India has turned into an oil money laundromat for the Kremlin. Yes, India buys discounted Russian crude, refines it, and sells fuel. But here's the kicker, the biggest buyers of that refined fuel are not India, it's Europe, the US, and others. In plain English, India isn't the laundromat, it's Europe's energy lifeline, keeping their factories, heaters, and cars running. If India didn't buy and refine that crude, Russia would just sell it to China, Turkey, or the Middle East anyway. So Navarro calling this laundering isn't just dumb, it's straight up hypocritical. Funny thing is, while he screams about India profiteering, even Ukraine itself is buying diesel from India, which, by the way, originates from Russian crude. So, by Navarro's own logic, Ukraine is part of this so-called oil laundromat. What now, is Zelensky a laundromat manager too? The US and EU don't want to touch Russian crude directly, but they're happy to buy the Indian refined version. That's like sending your dirty laundry to your neighbor, then blaming them because your socks still stink. Oh, and let's not forget, the Biden administration literally begged India to keep buying that oil to stabilize global prices. And then Navarro claims India's foreign policy is strategic freeloading. India isn't freeloading, it's strategically independent. The US is the one that's dependent. It can't take a single step without leaning on other countries. That's not superpower strength, that's superpower show-off. India buys weapons from Russia, energy from the Middle East, tech from the US, trades with Europe, and joins Quad to balance China. India pays in hard cash, oil, weapons, tech, no freebies, no bailouts. Unlike NATO allies, India doesn't hide under America's nuclear umbrella, nor does it demand US taxpayers to fund its defense. If anything, India carries its own weight by guarding the Indian Ocean, deterring China, and stabilizing South Asia, things the US benefits from too. Calling India a freeloader is like saying someone who builds their own house, cooks their own meals, and pays their own bills is freeloading, just because they're not under your control. Meanwhile, the real freeloaders are NATO countries, living rent-free under US protection, and still whining about America being too bossy. Navarro sneers about India being the tariff Maharaja. It's the same energy as a salty YouTube hater spamming first dislike under every video. A YouTube hater at least disappears into irrelevance after leaving their comment. Navarro, on the other hand, keeps logging back in every single day, wasting breath, recycling the same tired lines, and hoping someone, somewhere, still takes him seriously. At this point, he's less an economic voice and more like that one troll who lives rent-free in the comment section. But if we're handing out titles, maybe it's time we call the US the hypocrisy Maharaja. After all, Washington preaches free trade while slapping sanctions on half the planet. Talks about clean energy while being the world's biggest oil consumer. And now, cries about India's Russian oil, while Ukraine itself is buying diesel that comes from India's Russian crude. It's easy to go out on news channels and social media, spilling garbage about India, because Navarro knows most people aren't well versed in daily geopolitics. That's how he gets away with throwing catchy sound bites that sound smart, but collapse under fact-checking. The real tragedy is that the media hosting him doesn't even bother to question him, they just nod along. And so misinformation spreads on national TV, painting India as the villain, while the truth gets buried. But here's the thing, India doesn't need Navarro's approval to shape its destiny. It's not freeloaders, it's not anyone's laundromat, it's a sovereign nation making decisions in its own interest. And no amount of recycled, one-liners from a bitter ex-official is going to change that.